It is a big pleasure for Katrina and I, and have you, Ross Jackson, here in the Magic Garden. For Katrina and I, it is you are one of the great heroes in Denmark, as you have one foot in the financial world and another foot in the spiritual world. So give us a big hand.
Thank you very much. Actually, the topic tonight has nothing to do with either my interest in the financial world or the spiritual world. This is actually a completely different subject for me. In fact, I'm not a Shakespearean scholar, nor a Francis Bacon scholar for that matter. And the story I'm going to tell you about tonight, I'm telling you simply because it's a fantastic story. And it's one which I was unaware of until about 15 years ago, when I chanced upon a lecture in London, hearing about the theory that Francis Bacon had written the Shakespeare works. And I found that there's a large number of persons through the last 400 years that were convinced that the man from Stratford, Will Shakespeare, certainly could not have written them. And there is, of course, been quite a discussion about who it might have been. So tonight I'm going to tell you what I got convinced of by studying the material which was available on the question. The more I got into the material, the more I was convinced of the fact that Bacon must have done it. And tonight I'm going to explain why. First of all, I'd like to make a comment about this historical period. This period, late 16th, early 17th century, often called the Elizabethan Jacobean period in England, is one of the most written about and filmed periods in all of history. And yet, in some sense, all of these historical stories and films are missing a very central point, what I call the elephant in the room. They're all ignoring the reality of the fact that Francis Bacon was the son of Queen Elizabeth and was hoping to become king and follow her. And he was also the author of the Shakespearean works. And those two things are closely related. But without that knowledge of the role that he played in that period, most of the theories and discussions about what happened during Elizabeth's reign are quite distorted. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, run through some of the historical facts about the three main personages in this story: Queen Elizabeth, Francis Bacon, and Will Shakespeare. And then I'm going to tell you about what I would call the unknown history, and go on from there to talk about the evidence which supports the history as I will describe it. First of all, if we look at the historical Bacon, we know a lot of facts about this person because he was one of the major personages of his time. He's the son of Nicholas and Anne Bacon. Nicholas Bacon was one of Queen Elizabeth's most important ministers in her regime. He was actually sent to France by the Queen at the age of 16. This is well known and well documented. Rather strange because, according to the official history, he was the son of her minister. Why should she be sending him to France accompanied by the new ambassador to Paris? He was known as a professor of law for many years and a solicitor. In fact, he was one of the most competent justices ever in English history. What is not so well known is he was actually a leader of the House of Commons, of the Parliament, for almost 35 years, being elected at a very early age of about 21 and continuing for many, many years in that capacity. Bacon is best known perhaps to a modern public as the philosopher, a great philosopher, in fact. In fact, many have called him the father of empirical science. In Bacon's time, around the 1580s, 1590s, when he started to write, science was really not the way we understand it today. Science was almost what we would today call philosophy. There was no such thing as experimental science at that time. And this is a concept that Bacon introduced, the idea that in order to progress scientifically, we have to actually make theories and then test them and measure them in practice. Before that time, most people considered science to be based on the ideas of Aristotle, which was his thinking was very much theoretical and not particularly practical. He wrote several books, also a group of essays on various topics. His most well-known book is probably the one called The Advancement of Science. He also wrote one called Novum Organum and several other books, as a matter of fact. He also actually wrote several so-called masques. A masque is like a kind of a mini play, which is presented often for royalty to celebrate some particular event. And Bacon actually, in his own name, had written a few of these for both Elizabeth and James, her successor. In terms of the positions which he had in the society at the time, he was, during Elizabeth's reign, a so-called learned counsel. That is to say, he was an advisor to the Queen on various issues. He was also appointed Solicitor General under James, who succeeded Elizabeth. He was also later became the Attorney General. In fact, he became the Chief Justice of Chancery, which corresponds roughly to our Supreme Court here today, and the Lord Chancellor, which was the highest position in the government, the right-hand man of the king, actually. Another thing he is noted for today, if you ask some people, is the fact that he resigned his position in a scandal. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So these are the known facts about Francis Bacon. Now let's turn to Will Shakespeare. And what is known about this gentleman who some people claim wrote the Shakespeare works? What we know for sure from documents, and there aren't very many documents about this man at all, we know that he was a small-time moneylender. We know this because there are various records have survived showing that he had sued 3 or 4 different people on different occasions in the courts for very small sums, £5-6, something like that. He was also known to be a property and grain speculator in his hometown of Stratford-on-Avon. In terms of his acting, which some people often refer to him, the evidence is that he was, if an actor at all, it was a very, very minor actor. There's only one single instance of him ever being paid anything for either acting or for writing plays. And even that one case has been disputed by other scholars. There is quite extensive material available on the actors and playwrights of that time. And one book was written which refers to many of the major actors of the time. And most of them get 2 or 3 pages of mention in this book. Shakespeare gets about 2 or 3 lines. He was apparently a very, very minor actor, if an actor at all. There are only 6 known documents with his signature. And in these 6 signatures, they're spelled 3 different ways, and they're written in a way that looks like the person who wrote them was not used to writing at all. And what often was the case in those days was that if you were not literate, if you could not write or read, normally you had a sign you could make, like a cross or a stroke of some kind, and then you could have an educated person to actually sign on your behalf. And in fact, Will Shakespeare's father was such a person. He had a special sign. He was illiterate, and one of Shakespeare's 2 daughters was also illiterate. It's hard to believe that a man with an illiterate father and a daughter was able to be a great writer, and had not even taught his own child how to read and write. One thing we also know is that he was a shareholder, a 10% shareholder in the King's Men, which was one of the theatre groups that performed in London at that time. What also we know about Shakespeare is mentioned here. He was once arrested for disturbing the peace. We know that in his final will, which has survived, there is absolutely no mention of any books or manuscripts of any kind. No library was ever found in his home. No letter from or to him has ever been found. Actually, this was the one thing that got me interested in this story, because when I was at this lecture in London by a man by the name of Peter Dawkins, who's an expert on Bacon, he mentioned this fact, that nothing has ever survived with any letter written by William Shakespeare. One letter has been found that was written to him but never posted, but it had to do with a loan. And I thought, when I heard that, I said, this cannot be the author of the greatest literary work in history who has never had any correspondence. Because all the other major characters of this time have written to each other, and there is voluminous documents have survived about their correspondence. No one ever wrote a letter saying, hey, I had lunch with Will Shakespeare today, and he said da 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 da. It's as if he doesn't exist. There's no mention of him anywhere. Also, we know that from the Shakespeare work that whoever did write the Shakespeare work certainly had to have some inside contact with the court, because he expresses in many of his works knowledge about the inside workings of the royalty and the courts, and how to go hunting for falcons and that sort of thing. There's no evidence at all that he ever had any such contact. There's no evidence that he had any education. We know for sure that he never studied at a university. There was a grammar school in Stratford where he lived, where he could have learned to write and speak Latin, which was his primary language at the time. But it's pure speculation. We don't know for sure, because the records of that period never survived. So here we have what is known about this man, and that's not very much. By the way, you probably are aware that many biographies have been written about Will Shakespeare. But if you look more closely at them, they all start with the unstated assumption that he wrote the Shakespeare works. And therefore, most of the books are not really talking about the things that I'm mentioning here, which are the historical records, but they're saying things like, well, since many of the works clearly have been written by someone who had read original works in, for example, Italian and French, which were not translated into English at that period, then he must have been fluent in both of those languages, among other things. So he must have traveled a lot in Europe, and he must have learned those languages. He must have been a genius. He must have done this. He must have done that. They're all based on the supposition that he wrote the works. And of course, they have to conclude that he must have been a genius as well, to have this tremendous detailed knowledge of so many different fields, including legal knowledge, which we'll come back to a little later. Now let's look at the third historical character here, the Queen Elizabeth, who lived from 1533 to 1603 and was succeeded by King James of Scotland. Queen Elizabeth has always been known as the Virgin Queen, since she never married, officially at least. But she did have a very well-known love affair, which extended throughout her entire life, with the so-called the Earl of Leicester. Right from the very day that she became queen, he moved into her quarters and stayed with her the rest of his life and died before her. That is well known. It's also well known that Elizabeth was courted by many of the royalty of France and Spain. You must remember that at this time, there was the three great powers of Europe were England, Spain, and France. And a lot of the political activity had to do with who was allied with whom, and these alliances shifted from time to time. So the French wanted to form an alliance by having a marriage between their king and Elizabeth, and so did the Spanish. But she flirted a lot with them and led them on quite a bit, but she never made a marriage. And this is part of her strategy of keeping France and Spain more or less in balance and not favoring either one, and keeping herself out of any wars as she could. This was her strategy. But as I say, she had a lover, the Earl of Leicester, who she knew actually from childhood. Now I'm going to talk about the unknown Bacon, the story that really has not been told, and this is not until I wrote my book at least. There have been other books written about the idea of Bacon as a possible author of the Shakespeare works. But what I've done, which is different, is I've written it as a novel. And then I've written a second volume, which I call The Companion, which documents chapter by chapter the historical evidence for the facts in the novel. So it's what I call a documented novel. In this way, it makes it much easier to follow what actually happened. Of course, it does also involve introducing some fictional elements in order to make it hang together as a story. But these are very minor. All the major events in this book are well documented. So the matter of fact is that Bacon was not the son of Francis Bacon was not the son of Lord and Anne Bacon at all, Nicholas Bacon. He was the son of Elizabeth and Leicester. He used William Shakespeare as a pseudonym. I'll explain a little later why he did this. Now, the interesting thing is that the inner circle around the courts, they knew about this. It was a well-known fact. But it would have been disastrous for the Queen if these facts had become public knowledge. And the reason for this was that when Elizabeth became Queen and was living together with Dudley, he was actually married to another woman. And this was not very popular among the nobility, the fact that the Queen was consorting with a married man. And to make things worse, his wife died under mysterious circumstances, as Leicester's wife. And he was actually tried or accused of having something to do with it, but it was never proved, and he was not charged formally with anything. But there was a lot of suspicion that he had something to do with it. And then what happened was Queen Elizabeth became pregnant at this time, and the very day before Francis Bacon was born, Leicester and Elizabeth were secretly married. And there is certain evidence of this also from two independent sources. So this was a situation which was so explosive for Elizabeth. If this had been generally known, she probably would have lost her crown, she probably would have lost her head, because this was totally unacceptable at that time. One thing is for a man to have an affair, but for the Queen to have an affair like this, to have an unwed son while she was unwed, was not acceptable. And that's probably why they got married just the day before, in order to give him at least a semblance of legitimacy. So the inner circle, they knew all about this, because it would have been treasonous for them not to tell the so-called Privy Council, which is like the governing cabinet under the Queen. They would have to know this because it had very important consequences for the succession, and which is one of the most important functions that they had. So they knew this. This is about 18 different people. They knew very well about it. And there's a lot of correspondence between the courts of Spain and France with their ambassadors telling what's going on in London, and where they tell in many, many different correspondences about the real facts of the matter, about Bacon's relationship to the Queen. And so they knew all about this. But it was the historians of the day knew nothing. And this is why we never hear anything about these facts in the official histories of the time. So national security was the issue. And that was what demanded the great secrecy. Francis Bacon also had a little brother, Robert, known as Robert Devereux, later Lord Essex, a very well-known in historical terms military leader. He was born about 6 years after Francis and was brought up in another family called Devereux. And it was this other family that had the title of Lord Essex, which he took on when his father died. Another thing which is not perhaps realized by everyone is that what Bacon's whole very major mission in life was to create a renaissance in the English language and English literature. This was his big dream. At that time, there were only about 7%, I think, of the total population that could actually read Latin and speak Latin, which was the language of the intellectuals, whereas most of the people in the streets spoke a kind of English, but English was not a written language at that time. In fact, there were very few books in Bacon's time that were written in English. There were a few, but not very many. So one of the things he wanted to do was to change this, and so that he'd make English the most important language, and gradually adopt the English language to the standards that, for example, the French had achieved. The French had a renaissance where they introduced many new words based on the old classical languages, the Greek and so forth, and Latin. Bacon was also a major figure in the colonization of America, which it's known to some extent, but he in fact was a major instigator of the idea of sending people over to the New World and forming colonies there, because he was very forward thinking, and you could see the advantages of having bases over there. In fact, it's said that the founders of the American Constitution, including Thomas Jefferson, often had pictures of Francis Bacon on them all the time. He was their great inspiration for them. He was also the founder of the English Freemasons, which is a relatively new concept at the time. And I believe he was also the editor of the King James Bible, although the evidence for this is slightly uncertain. But what we do know for sure is that the King James Bible in English is considered one of the great masterpieces of the English language. And the way it developed was that a group of clergymen, who were the top people within the church, had gotten together and done a draft, but none of them were particularly literary. This draft was left with King James for a year, and suddenly after 1 year, the King James Bible as we know it today appeared. And I'm quite certain that in that period, the only person really in England at the time who could have converted that into a piece of art, that was Francis Bacon. Incidentally, of all the world's words in English which have been created that we know of, the person, most of them have come from the works of William Shakespeare. And the next most have come from Francis Bacon in his own writings. Interesting. Another thing about Bacon, which can be dug out of the various correspondences, but is not well known, is the fact that he actually married a commoner at one time in what I call a deal with the King James. See, the thing was that when King James succeeded Elizabeth, he knew very well from his contact with the Robert Cecil, who was the Secretary of State at the time, that Bacon was a tutor. He was the son of Elizabeth. Cecil had to tell him that. He was the head of the Privy Council, and he had to tell James that because he was a potential threat to King James, being coming from the Tudor line. And so, in order to make a deal, Bacon agreed that the agreement was that if he married a commoner, which would not be acceptable for a successor to the throne, he would be making himself ineligible and thus not be a threat to King James. And the deal was that if he did that, then he would be able to get official appointments in the government, for example, as a Solicitor General and later the Attorney General. This is exactly what happened. The very day he got married to this commoner, he wrote a letter to the three major leaders of the Privy Council and demanded, in fact, that they recognize the deal and give him his knighthood. Getting his knighthood was the first step necessary to have a career in the civil service, and he got that right away. So this way, he was no longer a threat to King James. And they were actually quite close because he was such a talented person. The king could use him for all kinds of tasks. And as I mentioned earlier, he later became the right-hand man of the king as the chancellor. Now back to this question of the scandal. When Bacon was Chief Justice, the king at that time, King James, King James was a sort of a bisexual. He was married and had 3 children, but at the same time he was a homosexual and had a so-called favorite who's known as the Duke of Buckingham, a young man who followed him everywhere, and he got a lot of power, became almost the second most powerful man in the realm. James was basically running the England as a mafia operation. In those days, we had the so-called rights of kings, and for the king, the whole country was his personal property. It's hard for us to imagine that today, but that's the way it was in the 16th century. The king owned the country. He could do whatever he wanted, but he had to raise funds somehow. And so what James did was he ran prostitution rings and extortion rings. It was a strict mafia operation, just taken right out of Sicily in this last century. And of course, Bacon advised him against this. Bacon was a very, very highly developed spiritual master, actually, and he was opposed to all this kinds of corruption and tried to get the king to give up this activity and raise funds by normal taxes and so forth. But the people were very, very unhappy with this because and people in the parliament, where Bacon also was the leader, they started to make a revolt against the king, and they were demanding blood. They were demanding that heads had to roll because of all these mafia operations, and they said we have to put an end to this. And so basically King James was faced with the problem of offering one of his major power pals. The one was Bacon, who is the Chancellor and the Chief Justice, and the other was his sexual partner, the Duke of Buckingham. And he chose Bacon. He chose to offer Bacon. Bacon, it turns out, had been accused of bribery by one of his junior employees. It was totally lies. It wasn't true at all. But he had to defend himself in order to prove his innocence. And the king made the deal with him, which is also revealed in various correspondences, that if he did not defend himself and accepted the verdict of the House of Lords, who had the authority to make the decision, then he would be given a large fine. He would be put into the Tower of London, but his fines would be reneged. He wouldn't have to pay them in practice. He would have just a one-night stay in the Tower, and his titles would be maintained, and he would maintain his home, which was adjacent to the royal palace where his father had lived. So what happened was, as Bacon refused to defend himself, he didn't actually confess. He just said, "I will not defend myself." And the Lords then made this judgment that he was guilty of bribery. Turned out much later, this fellow who had made this claim later on rescinded it, but many years later, and said that it was all a lie and that Bacon was a very honest person. But in the meantime, the historians never got the real story. They just based their conclusions about that he was a corrupt judge on some of these, the popular interpretation. So I mean, an unjust stain has been put on Bacon's name. And one of the reasons I actually wrote that book was that in his final biography, or his autobiography, his diary, if you like, he said he would leave it to the successive ages to clear his name. I actually made an attempt to do that a few years back. I sent a letter to the Minister of the Interior in the UK and asked him to raise the issue once more about the innocence of Bacon, because he was not a corrupt judge, and his name has been scandalized. And I contacted some of his successors in the Bacon family, who was still living in pretty much the same castle they had those days. And they had to support this idea, and they did support it. But nevertheless, the Minister of the Interior, he said that he felt that the case was too old, that they would take it up again. So that's a real shame. It's a real shame, actually. Now let's turn to some of the evidence. First of all, there's lots of evidence, written evidence. Many of it was suppressed for many, many years and was not available for a long time. You have to remember also that for about 200 years or so after the death of both Bacon and Shakespeare, no one really questioned the authorship. I mean, okay, the plays they were popular at times, and at other times they were less popular, but they've been put on many times through the years under the name of William Shakespeare. Nobody really thought much about who this guy was until about after 200 years or so. Some people in the 1800s, they began to do some research and try to find out who this William Shakespeare actually was. And then various kinds of evidence began to pop up. Some of the evidence for what was going on first actually was published in the 1930s or so, 1940s. I mean, this is a long time after these, and much of the other evidence was published in drips over the 400 years or so that it went on after the main characters had left the scene. One of the most critical sources is the Spanish ambassador's notes back to the court in Madrid as to what was happening in London, and he makes it very clear that Bacon was the son of Elizabeth, for example. Another evidence for this is simply the physical resemblance. Many people have remarked how Bacon resembled the Queen much more than he resembled Lord Bacon or Lady Anne. It's quite well known that Bacon had a special relationship with the Queen. She was known when he was very young to have him in at her personal quarters quite often. He would play the lute and they would sing together, and she made sure that he got a good upbringing, a good education, and so forth. That's all quite well known. And a lot of people, of course, were quite mystified by this, why he was spending so much time there when he was the son of one of her ministers. Another interesting detail is that if you look at the genealogy, that is to say, the family tree of the Bacons at the time, Nicholas Bacon had several children. Francis is not mentioned as his son, one of his sons. The only actually connection between Francis Bacon and Nicholas Bacon in the official records is another set of records which says that he was born in York Place. York Place was the residence of the Lord Bacon, which is adjacent to the palace. Then there was this deal with King James that I mentioned, where he, in order not to be a threat, agreed to marry a commoner, and once he did that, his career began to increase. He got major appointments. A little background on Pallas Athena. Pallas Athena is known to be the muse of Shakespeare, as he writes himself in the Shakespeare sonnets. There are 154 sonnets written by, well, we don't know who they were written by. They were actually published as the Shakespeare sonnets. Shake with a hyphen, spear sonnets. The name William Shakespeare is not written on these sonnets. They were published as the Shakespeare sonnets. People assume that, well, that must be Will Shakespeare that wrote them, but they're not written anywhere that he wrote them on the document. But it is written in some of the sonnets, two of them at least, that Shakespeare considered Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess who was the patron of the arts and sciences, as his muse or inspiration. And this is a picture of the Greek goddess here. She was known as the spear shaker. You see, she has this long spear. And in the mythology of the time, she used her spear to shake ignorance out of people and make them more intelligent and wise. The shaker of the spear. And this is, of course, where the title comes from. But the interesting thing is that Bacon also had Pallas Athena as his muse, which is based on quite independent evidence. I'll mention that in a minute, but one of the pieces of evidence, well, I can go ahead and show it. I think it's on the next page here. Yeah. There's a fellow by the name of Jesse. He was the secretary to the Duke of Anjou, which is was closely related to the royal family in France at the time. Francis Bacon visited as a teenager the French court. In fact, while Bacon was in France from the ages of roughly 16 to 19, he traveled for 2 or 3 years with the court around different places in France, and was very good friends with the king and his sister in particular, he fell in love with, and knew many of the top people, including La Jesse, who was the secretary to one of the major persons at the time, the Duke of d'Anjou. He was actually the brother of the king, I believe. Well, La Jesse, he wrote a poem which first surfaced in 1917. It's 1917. And in this poem, he refers to Bacon, who had visited him back as a 17-year-old in Paris, as having Pallas Athena as his muse. So what I think the real story is that when Bacon was visiting France as a teenager, he was very inspired by the French Renaissance, and Ronsard in particular, who was the leader, who was doing all the things that he wanted to do with the English language. He'd done it already with the French language. And so my guess is, and I tell this in the book in this way, that he mentions to Ronsard that the fact that his muse is Pallas Athena, the shaker of the spear. And therefore, at that time he began writing a diary, and I believe this diary is in fact what the Shakespeare sonnets are. And he called them the Shakespeare sonnets because it was referring to Pallas Athena. It was first at a much later date that he actually came across a man many years later who actually had the name William Shakespeare, and he thought, aha, there's a very interesting coincidence. But originally, I believe the Shakespeare sonnets were his personal diary. And if we study the sonnets, we'll see that a lot of them have to do with his appeals to the Queen to acknowledge him as her son and successor. Of course, the Queen wouldn't risk doing that, and she had to keep putting him off. So he was very frustrated, and this is one reason why he wrote all these plays about the succession of kings, going all the way back to Edward II. I think a number of the Shakespeare's plays have to do with the kings up until Henry VIII. And I think it's simply because that was his vision. He wanted to succeed Elizabeth. But one reason he didn't was partly because of the politics. She couldn't acknowledge him without risking war, actually, or losing her crown. But also they were very much in disagreement about policies. Bacon, as a member of Parliament, was very much a defender of the little man, of the poor people. He was, some people call him the first Democrat, actually. And he opposed the Queen's wishes on several occasions, where she wanted to put heavy taxes on people to pay for a war. And he said, no, this is much too heavy. We have to spread it out over 3 or 4 years and not do it in 2 years. Like, give them a break, you know. And she was furious with him for opposing her. And that was another reason why she didn't feel that he was the right person to succeed her, I think. Then there's the question of the literary establishment. Just as I mentioned that the courts knew very well, the Privy Council knew very well that Bacon was, and also Robert Devereux for that matter, were both sons of the Queen and Leicester. In the same way, within the literary establishment, the top people, there weren't very many. Remember, this is a very small town, and compared to today, it was 200,000 people or something like that. And the number of persons who had a higher education at the universities, there were maybe hundreds, but certainly not thousands. And they knew each other. Everybody who was doing writing in English or Latin, the small literary group, they knew each other. They all knew that Bacon was writing the Shakespeare works. And how do we know that? Well, there's a lot of evidence for it. One of them is this, one of the people called Peacham wrote a book called The Complete Gentleman in 1622. And in this book, he praised all of the authors of his time who were not living. And one of these who was not living was Shakespeare, because he died in 1616. And he's mentioned nowhere in the book, even though he was one of the major authors of the time, the playwrights of the time. Why? Because he knew very well, Bacon was still alive in 1622. He knew very well that Bacon was writing Shakespeare works. He was still alive, and he was continuing to write. In fact, in 1623, the collected works were published, the so-called folio, with a lot of new material that was written after Will Shakespeare's death in that 6-year or 8-year period. So the inner circle, they knew it very well. Another example of this is in around 1597-98, there were two members of the literary establishment called Hall and Marston who wrote some various poems to each other and to the public. And without going into the literary details, the literary interpretation is well accepted by all Shakespeare scholars. They claimed that Bacon had written the first 3 works under the name of William Shakespeare. And this is at a time when these are the only works that had been published at that time. There were only 3 works. There was a couple of poems and I think King Henry IV, Part 1. Now I think that's quite interesting. Now here you have 2 people already when they're both in their 30s is claiming that Bacon, he wrote those poems and not Henry IV. And actually, at that time, the Archbishop of Canterbury was a former tutor of Bacon from Cambridge University and a personal friend. And he demanded that those satires that were written by Hall and Marston should be burned. And he was afraid, apparently, that it would come out that it was Bacon that actually had done the writings. He didn't want any more rumors about that going on. But of course, he knew it very well, too. A couple of other interesting examples about the evidence. At this time, there was a tradition in England that when one of the major poets or authors of the day died, there was an outpouring of praise from all his fellows, from the literary circles, about how great he was and so on. It was a tradition. When Shakespeare died, there was nothing. Will Shakespeare died in 1616. There was absolutely nothing. Nobody was praising the Shakespeare works. How come? I mean, it's just unbelievable. But when Bacon died in 1626, it was 10 years later, there was a tremendous outpouring of praise from all of the literary establishment about how great he was. In fact, a book was published called Manus Vergilamiani. There was so much praise for him. And the interesting thing about this book is they praise not his prose, but his poetry in various ways. And they refer many times to Pallas Athena and his inspiration of the muse and so forth. They're almost screaming the truth out. But it's clear that Bacon didn't want it to be known. He wanted to keep it secret. But they couldn't hold back. And they praised him. He never published a single poem in his own name. Some more evidence. One of the most strongest pieces of evidence has to do with the metaphors of legal terms in the Shakespeare works. Many legal experts have analyzed them because I think 1/3 of almost all metaphors used in Shakespeare works have a legal background, which is extremely strange. And of course, many people have commented, well, whoever wrote the Shakespeare works must have been a very competent legal person, a lawyer or a judge or something like that, because the thing is that there's not one single error in the way he uses these terms, even though many of them are very, very arcane, very rarely used. They've been analyzed by experts, and they said he never made a single mistake. Of course, Bacon was known as the greatest legal brain of his age, and so how could a person with a background like, even if he did go to grammar school, Will Shakespeare could never have had that legal knowledge. Some people say, well, maybe he hadn't around the courts. You know, he's a genius. But there are a number of legal experts later on who said this is impossible. Anyone who had that kind of knowledge must, at the minimum, have witnessed, you know, some documents. And so the Shakespearean people have searched all of the documents from that period to see if his signature ever appeared on any legal document as a witness or something. Never. So this is one of the very powerful arguments, and it's also a very powerful argument to eliminate other candidates. For example, many people today and for many years have claimed that the real author of the Shakespeare works was Lord, what is his name now? It slips my mind. Some people have claimed that it was a man who died in 1593. Terrible not remembering his names now.
Is it De Vere?
Pardon?
De Vere?
No.
Marlowe.
Marlowe was claimed to have written some of the Shakespeare works, even by Shakespeare authors. Because they say that many of the early works could not have been written by Shakespeare because he was too young to have written them. Like The Rape of Lucrece, for example, which came out in 1592, that sort of thing. But Bacon could have. He was a little older. And so Marlowe, I keep forgetting his name. Marlowe was considered as a possible candidate for the early writings of Shakespeare. He's a talented writer, but he hadn't actually published any plays under his own name. But he was nowadays considered to be one of the possibilities. But he was not a legal man. He was not. He actually worked with the intelligence services. So he could not have been the legal brain behind the Shakespeare works either. In fact, none of the other possible candidates could live up to the qualification. Another interesting piece of evidence is the Shakespeare play called Love's Labour's Lost. This story takes place in France. And if you study all the places which are mentioned in the Love's Labour's Lost, they compare very precisely with all the places that Francis Bacon visited as a teenager when he was traveling around with the French court. Not only that, but there are 4 names mentioned in Love's Labour's Lost, 4 French names, which turn up in the passport of Bacon's brother Anthony in 1920. It was first discovered in the 20th century that here in Anthony Bacon's passport, you find the same 4 names with very slight spelling differences that appear in Love's Labour's Lost. And so even Shakespeare scholars who believe Will Shakespeare wrote the plays are at a loss to explain that. They say at least he must have somehow got a hold of Anthony Bacon's passport. Because that's the only place you see those 4 names anyway. Another interesting story is the play called The Tempest, which was one of the last plays written by Shakespeare. And they had to do with one of the ships which was sailing over to the New World went aground in Bermuda. And this was the basis, most scholars agree, for the description of given in the book called The Tempest of a shipwreck, because there's tremendous correspondence between the two. This fellow Strachey, he was on that trip, and at this time Bacon was the chairman of the company which was financing the emigration to the New World. And Strachey wrote a letter to the company where Bacon was the chairman, telling about what had happened. They had stayed over the winter in Bermuda and then built new ships and sailed on again to Jamestown. And this play was put on for the first time in I think it was 1611, November 1611. And at that time, there was no way that Will Shakespeare or anyone else could have had access to Strachey's letter, because it was a state secret. It was very confidential. Only the company where Bacon was the chairman and the government would have known about it, because it was a question of national security. If the Spanish had gotten a hold of that information and knew how terribly weak Jamestown was, they would have risked, the English would have risked having the Spanish coming in and taking it over, because they were competing at that time with who was going to get the strongest foothold in the new world. So it seems very clear that Bacon had access to that. These descriptions of the shipwreck, which were repeated almost verbatim in The Tempest, whereas Will Shakespeare didn't. Then there's another interesting detail. When James was appointed to succeed Elizabeth, he was traveling down from Edinburgh to take over the English court in London. And of course, Bacon was afraid of what might happen, because he was aware, I'm sure, of the fact that James knew he was a Tudor. So he wanted to get on good terms with James. And he had heard, and it's well known, that James was a tremendous fan of Shakespeare, the Shakespeare works. And so Bacon let it be known indirectly through a friend of his who talked with the king on the way down that he, in fact, was the author of the Shakespeare works. One of his literary friends told the king that. And Bacon wrote a letter where he signed it as the concealed poet. Very interesting. See, as I say, he never wrote a single poet in his own name. But that was the way he made sure that he got on good terms with King James. Then there's another thing is that the so-called promise. Promise is simply a Latin word that means like an inventory of something. And what in this case, the promise was a notebook that was Bacon's. It's well established by all scholars that this was Bacon's, but it first turned up about 100 years or so after Bacon's death in somebody's attic, and it was traced to him. And it was his handwriting, and it was his material. There's no question about it. But the interesting thing is that in this promise, there were written down all kinds of phrases that an author might write down for future use. Strange phrases. Some of them are quite common. Some are quite unique. The interesting thing is you never see any of these phrases used in Bacon's own prose writings, but you find about 300 of them appearing in the Shakespeare works, and in particular Romeo and Juliet. It's more than a coincidence. It has to be whoever wrote those changes into Romeo and Juliet must have had access to this document. I mean, some of the phrases are so unique. I'll give you a couple of examples a bit later. Yeah, here are some of them here. For example, the one I use on the back of my book here, I like this one. Bacon, in one of his essays, writes, "Be so true to thyself as thou be not false to others." And Shakespeare, in one of his plays, writes, "To thine own self be true, and it must follow as night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." I think that's really fantastic. And you don't see this idea anywhere else in the literature, anywhere. Just once by Bacon and once by Shakespeare. And there are many, many similar examples like that. I have mentioned a number of them in the book. I mentioned also here a little quote from Cockburn. Cockburn is actually the correct pronunciation. He was a scholar of this whole question of the authorship, and he wrote a very, very well documented book, which was published in the 1990s, where he goes through all the arguments for and against Bacon as possible author, and concludes with no hesitation. He says there's really no other explanation that Bacon must have done it. And he says one of the reasons why the scholars, the Shakespearean scholars, are not aware of this is, he says, they have not read Bacon. And he said, if you read Bacon, if you really know Bacon, you will find that many of the same strange phrases and having a very, very special meaning are the same ones which appear in Shakespeare. And he gives a number of examples of this, or expressions which are never found anywhere else in the literature. Now, how are we doing for time? Maybe,
A short break?
do we have a little break? Or we could go on a little further. What do you think?
Go on.
Should we go on another 15 minutes and then take a break? Well, we want to have time for some questions anyway. One of the most fascinating things about this whole story is that between Shakespeare's death in 1616, Will Shakespeare, and Bacon's publication, or at least the publication of the so-called collected works, the 1623 folio of all the collected works of Shakespeare, a number of changes are introduced which were not published previously. And I have in my book, and I have here a number of examples of this, which you might say, unless Shakespeare rose from the grave, who else could have written these changes? A couple of examples. Around that time, there was a big discussion about whether the moon affected the tides. And Bacon wrote in one of his essays around 1600 or so, that he believed in this theory that the moon affects the tides. But there were a lot of people who disagreed with that. And in Hamlet's, the Shakespeare play of Hamlet, there is a clause at one point where it refers to Neptune and the effect of the moon on the tides. So that apparently Will Shakespeare, whoever wrote the Shakespeare works, believed in that theory as well. Now, it turned out in 1616, roughly, in another essay or another publication, Bacon changed his mind. He said, no, I don't believe it anymore. I don't believe that it's right. And this is after the death of Will Shakespeare. In the final edition of Hamlet that appeared in 1623, these 4 lines are removed. And there's a similar thing happens in Hamlet regarding, there was another issue which people discussed, was the idea that if something moves, then it must have intelligence. Okay, it seems kind of strange for us today, but that was a debate they had, and some people said, no, that's no proof, Well, this is a similar case again, where Bacon wrote in an early time that he believed this theory, and it turns out in the Hamlet, in one of the earlier publications, but in the 1623 folio, these lines are removed, and at the same time, Bacon writes that he doesn't believe that theory anymore either. So, and there are many other very good examples here. One of them was in King Henry IV too. It was in the original play. The Chancellor is removed from office. This is quite an earlier period, and 2 particular lords came to take his so-called seal when he had to leave office, and that's what appears in the early editions of Henry IV. In the later edition, there are 4 people who come and collect the key, the Great Seal from the Chancellor who's removed from office. And it turns out that in Bacon's case, when he lost the seal after the scandal, he had to resign as Chief Justice. There were these 4 people that are mentioned in the play, were the 4 that came to him. Now, there's no reason why Will Shakespeare would have made such a change between 1600 and 1623, but there's a good reason that Bacon could have done it. Yeah, when there are many cases like that. I think that's some of the most stronger arguments are the way that these changes occurred, and who could possibly have made these changes other than Bacon. We don't know for sure who had the actual manuscripts during that time. some people claim that the King's Men, where William Shakespeare had a 10% interest, had all the manuscripts and so forth. But actually, they never turned up. No one has ever found the original manuscripts of the Shakespeare works, which might strike us as strange today because they would be very, very valuable. But in those days, they weren't considered to be valuable. And it was first around that time that some authors began to keep the original manuscripts. But one of the big mysteries about the whole issue of the Shakespeare works is, have they survived somewhere? And maybe after the break, I can tell you one of the theories about where they might be today, if they have survived. So let's take a little break.
Okay.
Okay. So I mentioned just before the break this question about where are the manuscripts, if they have survived anywhere. And there is one theory which is a bit fascinating, and that is that they may be buried on an island in Nova Scotia, Canada, a place called Oak Island. There's been a lot of speculation. The background is this, that something was buried in a very intricate burial place on this island somewhere around the period of 1600, plus or minus 80 years. This has been established through various kinds of carbon-14 analyses. And whoever buried it must have been very professional. I think almost the only people at that time could have built such a complicated structure was the military. And apparently, what they did is they made a deep well, almost about, I think it was about 5 meters by 5 meters, quite large, deep down into the bedrock below, and they made it very difficult for anyone to come down, because by putting oak beams at different intervals all the way up, and they also had 2 places where there were contacts with water, so that anybody who dug directly down would be flooded from water coming in from 2 different beaches. It was a very sophisticated structure. And so something very, very valuable must have been buried there. Now, for 200 years now, various engineering companies have been trying to discover what's buried there. And nobody succeeded yet in doing it. But one thing they did find, one group, was that they sent a drill down, and they sent a camera down to see if they could see anything. And apparently the camera was able to identify under the bedrock that there were some large, what do we call them, sort of structures that looked like wooden boxes or something like that, and something might be inside them. So they drilled through one of these wooden lids, and they found, looking at the drill afterwards, that there were particles of parchment. So apparently, some written documents. Also, there were traces of mercury. And Bacon actually wrote an essay once about how you could use mercury to preserve documents underwater. And he also wrote another essay on telling how you could build a sort of a flood trap, precisely of the type that was found there. He writes about this in a couple of his essays. So he may very well have something to do with it. The other part of the story is that Bacon was the leader of the Freemasons in the UK, or in England at that time. It's a bit of a long story, but the Freemasons evolved out of the Knights of Templar, which is a group that goes much further back in time. But in around the 13th century, they were pretty much destroyed by the French king and the Pope. And some of them, however, did escape to Scotland and may have been taking their treasures. They were known as the Bank of Europe at that time. They were the richest people, richer than any of the kingdoms in Europe at that time. And therefore, they were very much a power factor. And the French and king and the Pope were not happy about that. So they were basically rounded up and executed as heretics. But anyway, some of them apparently escaped to Scotland, and they built a place called what was this? Oh, the name is forgetting again. But in this case, a chapel up there. And the theory is that they may have just buried the treasures of the Templars, which were extremely valuable, somewhere in that chapel. Well, around about 1620 or so, it's well known that there are a lot of people who are starting to dig into the chapel and trying to find out that there was some treasures hidden below. And so the theory is that the Freemasons who were responsible for this were afraid that they would have to move the treasure somewhere else that was safe. At that time, one of Bacon's close colleagues in Scotland was given the mandate of colonizing this area around Nova Scotia, and was given ships and men military by King James in order to carry it out. And so it's quite possible that he could have used this colonization task as a cover for also transferring the treasures from the chapel in Scotland to Oak Island. Anyway, it's very speculative, but it's interesting. There's some coincidences there that it could possibly mean that at some point, perhaps the manuscripts will be discovered on Oak Island, and if so, there might be a final proof of the authorship question. We'll see. Anyway, that's a bit of a side issue. I wanted just to say a few other things about Bacon's works and Shakespeare works. One of the things that links them together is this various kinds of diagrams or drawings like this here. It was very common at the time, sometimes when you published essays and plays and papers and things like that, and the Bible for that matter, that you decorated them with this kind of symbols. You notice this symbol here is what is called the double A. You see there's an A on the left and another A on the right. One is light and one is dark. And this was very typical of Bacon's thinking, that you have the concealed truths and you have the light on the one side and the dark on the other. And this appears in many places. So it appears in Bacon's essays. It appears in some of the Shakespeare works. For example, Richard III, in the Shakespeare sonnets it appears. The 1623 folio, it appears in one of Bacon's Hebrew grammars that he used at the university. It appears. Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, the first two poems that were written under the William Shakespeare name, they appear. So you see a lot of strange coincidences in the use of this. It wasn't found anywhere else that we know of in those sources of either Shakespeare or Bacon. One of his favorite emblems, which he used in Novum Organum, was this one here also, and it appears also in the King James Bible, and in the folio, and in Spenser's Faerie Queene. I believe Spenser also was another pseudonym for Bacon. Many people have remarked that the Faerie Queene book is written in very much the same style as the Shakespeare works. Another one is the so-called sunburst face, which comes out of the Freemason movement. And it appears on the Venus and Adonis, this first poem of Will Shakespeare, the King James Bible, the sonnets, also in Bacon's, the book after his death, Manus Verulamiani, and in Canterbury Tower, which was the office of the Freemasons in London. So you have a lot of these strange similarities between Bacon and Shakespeare. All of that is very circumstantial, of course, and I wouldn't consider it as real evidence. But it's all of these different indirect indications that kind of, when you put them all together, all seem to point in the same direction. So why did Bacon write these plays, and why under a pseudonym? I think we have to realize, first of all, going back to what Bacon's mission in life was, this idea of the English Renaissance, of introducing the English language as a source of literature. So it wasn't just a language of the streets. he wanted people to start writing in English. So he organized a group. He had a group of people who had university educations and were literary people working with him, translating all kinds of material from the classics and also from the French and Italian sources and German sources, and just generally raising the whole level of knowledge about literature and so forth in the society. And his idea was that education was important also. There were so few people that could actually read and write in those days. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to reach out to the entire society with his dream. But how do you do that when only 7% of them can actually read? And that's why he got the idea of using the theater. This is his way of expressing the same ideas that appear in his philosophy in the Shakespeare plays. And many have compared Bacon's philosophical works in prose with the Shakespeare works, and many have been amazed at the fact that they seem to have the same sort of values, and they use the same kind of very flowery language, very lovely language, but in different ways. One's prose and one is blank verse normally. So this is the reason why he wrote the plays. But why did he not write them under his own name then? And the answer there is he was hoping to become king, and writing plays was not the sort of thing that you did if you wanted to become king. It was looked down upon. The theater was kind of a place for the lower classes to meet, and writing plays for them was not considered to be the sort of activity that you would do in the royal family. So he had to find a pseudonym. And also pseudonyms were very common at that time. His foster parents, Nicholas and Anne Bacon, had both published things both in their own names and under pseudonyms. And one reason they wrote under pseudonyms was in both cases they'd gotten into trouble with the Queen for expressing views that she wasn't happy about. For example, Anne had written something about the Mary Queen of Scots, who was a claimant to the throne living up in Edinburgh, that the Queen was very unhappy with. And so from his foster parents, he probably learned at a very early age that writing under your own name could be dangerous. In fact, there's an interesting example. There was a historian, which I mentioned in my book, there was a historian who actually wrote a short piece on Richard II. And of course, Shakespeare had also written a book on Richard II. But at that time, there was a lot of talk about revolution in England. And when this historian wrote this book about Richard II, and it was actually endorsed by Lord Essex, who was not only the Queen's second son, but he was also the leader of the military, and many people were speculating that he wanted to take the throne from Elizabeth and make a revolution. And this publication then was about Richard II, who did precisely that in his own time. He made a revolution. And so this was considered to be treasonous. He was put into the Tower for 2 years, this historian, just for writing a historical piece about Richard II. And so you could see the danger involved if Bacon had written his own name on that play. But of course the Queen knew that he had written that. If in fact Will Shakespeare had written the play, it's possible he might have ended up in the Tower as well. But of course she was protecting her son. But these are the reasons why it made a lot of sense to do that. Why this particular pseudonym? Well, I mentioned earlier the idea that I believe his personal diary was called the Shakespeare Sonnets with a hyphen. And then at some point he heard through his mutual friend, probably Burbage, who was one of the leaders of one of the theaters where a lot of the plays were put on. They would have known each other quite well. Shakespeare was apparently working for him, apparently taking care of the horses of the nobility and so forth. And so there was a very likelihood, which I describe it in a fictionalized form in the book, where Bacon meets Shakespeare, who's taking care of his horses at one of the plays, which is he's looking at to test out the first time it's been performed and make corrections and so on. And so he finds out that there is this guy who has the name William Shakespeare, and he at that time was looking for a pseudonym. And this sounded like it was an ideal one. So what I think he did, and there's some evidence for this too, that he, through some of his friends, managed to pay Will Shakespeare, I think it was something like £1,000 or something like that at the time, to have the permission to use his name on future publications. And it was shortly after this that Shakespeare, who wasn't a wealthy person by any means, suddenly had funds, and he began investing in the theater, 10% interest in the King's Men. He bought some properties up in Southford and so on. Where did the money come from? Well, there are some indirect indications where it came from. Bacon, by the way, personally was not a wealthy person. He was, in fact, almost broke all the time. He had the habit, when he was the Chief Justice, of putting money in a pot, which was available for anybody who had need of money. They could just go in and take what they needed. And he had a very modest salary. So he was always close to being bankrupt. And he was spending all the funds he could get on his literary activities. He was being financed, by the way, by Queen Elizabeth and the Privy Council. They felt that he was doing worthy work, and that they should help him develop this mission of this vision he had about the Renaissance. And also he got a lot of help from Lord Essex, his little brother, who came into a lot of money when his father died. He was one of the wealthiest people in England, and he also financed a lot of Bacon's work. So did his brother Anthony. He also had some funds. But when Bacon's father Nicholas died, all of the estate went to Anthony. Nothing went to Francis. And it was written in the will that only if Francis should die at some point would Francis get anything. And that's actually what happened at a much later date. And so he did get some property. But for most of his life, he was really struggling financially, using all his money on his literary pursuits. So the next question, really, does it really matter who wrote Shakespeare? By the way, I mentioned before the break, I couldn't remember the name of this other competing source, and that is Edward de Vere, the Lord of Oxford, who was a well-known poet at the time, who a number of people think could have written the Shakespeare works. And their main argument is that many of the events which happen in the plays reflect things which happened in the life of Edward de Vere. But as some Baconians have pointed out, you can find just as many examples in the Shakespeare works that corresponded to events in Bacon's career. For example, his trip to France is one of the best examples. Besides which, de Vere was absent most of the 1590s, when most of the Shakespeare works were written. He was abroad. It would have been difficult for him to have close contact with the court and with what was going on in London at the time. And there's also this question of the Tempest, which was based on the shipwreck of the Sea Venture in 1610. Well, de Vere was dead at that time. He died in 1605. So he couldn't have written the Tempest. So, and again, there's the legal issue, and he didn't have the legal background to do it either. So, yes, it does matter, and the reason it matters is that in interpreting any work of literature, it helps an awful lot to know who the author is and what his background is. But with William Shakespeare of Stratford, we know nothing about the man. I mean, it's like these works are just appearing out of nowhere. There's no reference point to anything. Whereas in Bacon's case, you have one of the major personages of the time with a tremendous amount of knowledge about his life. And if you look at it more carefully, you see that the works in many ways are the story of his life. In the early period, he was writing about all these kings, and he was hoping to become king. Later on, he gave up that idea and instead supported his little brother Essex to become king. Then when Essex was actually executed by his mother, in 1600 because he made a very stupid, clumsy attempt to take the throne from her and was accused of treason. And so that was the background, I think, for Bacon to write Hamlet. He was very depressed after that. And a number of the Shakespeare works which appeared after that, the tragedies, were based, I think, on the tragedy of his own brother and the Queen's relationship to him. Incidentally, there's a very interesting story around on this Lord Essex and his execution, in that the two of them, Robert de Vere, or Lord Essex, and the Queen, were like Flintstones. They had the same type of very dominant personality, and they were always in conflict with each other. They couldn't agree almost on anything. And he wanted her to give up the throne and appoint him as her successor, and she wouldn't do it. And so he went off to war without her permission and so forth. But when it became clear that he was doing things which were treasonous, she said to him, "If you come back on your knees and ask for my forgiveness, I will give it to you. And here's a ring. You send me this ring from the tower, and I'll know that you are asking for forgiveness, and I will give a pardon." And that, of course, was very, very difficult for him. He was a very proud man. Nevertheless, the story is that he did actually decide he would rather live than die. So he sent the ring to the Queen through a courier. But it was intercepted. It was intercepted by some of his enemies at court. Among others, Raleigh, who was one of his. They were competing for the graces of the Queen as both military people, and so Raleigh and his colleagues managed to stop the ring from getting to the Queen. And so when it didn't come, and the time of his execution arrived, she sent the order out to have him executed. Then she withdrew it again, a couple hours later. She was really in great doubt right to the last minute. She waited another 48 hours, and then she sent it a second time. And the second time it was done. So she wanted to give him every chance possible to send that ring. Then what happened was, 3 years later, one of her good friends on her deathbed admitted that she and her husband had taken the ring and prevented her from getting it. And the Queen was simply devastated when she heard that. And from that point on, she just was in seclusion, and she was known to be muttering the name of Robert all the time. "Forgive me for doing what I did." And basically she died in that state shortly after. Very a tremendous tragedy, which has never been told, but there's a lot of indirect evidence that it's true. And I mentioned many of the sources in my book. So that's why I say this story is a Shakespearean drama of the first rank. This is a real tragedy. So just think of the enormous reinterpretations that could occur of the Shakespeare works if it was known, if it accepted that Bacon was you'd have enough work to have researchers going for the next 200 years, and analyze, all aspects of his life and so forth. So finally, I'm going to round off I'm going to read you one of the sonnets. The Shakespeare sonnets consist of 154 sonnets, and one of them, I believe, was written by Bacon to Will Shakespeare of Stratford. And I'd just like to read it for you. It's very touching. He says, "Or I shall live your epitaph to make, or you survive when I in earth am rotten. From hence your memory death cannot take, although in me each part will be forgotten. Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I, once gone, to all the world must die. The earth can yield me but a common grave, when you, entombed in men's eyes, shall lie. Your monument shall be my gentle verse, which eyes not yet created shall ever read. And tongues to be, your being shall rehearse, when all the breathers of this world are dead. You still shall live, such virtue hath my pen, where breath most breathes, even in the mouths of men. So he knew that Shakespeare's name would live, and that he would be forgotten. That was his. Yeah. I mean, how can you otherwise interpret such a sonnet? I mean, the normal interpretation of the Stratfordians is that, well, he must have had some relationship with a younger man. You know, and some thought he was a homosexual and so on.
Like in Greece.
Okay, well, that's it. Now we're open for questions and comments. So, has anyone been convinced that wasn't convinced?
I just thinking.
Just still thinking.
I have a question. What do you think what effect would it have if the broader public knew about the story that you're telling now, that it is Francis Bacon and not William Shakespeare as we know him? And what would it mean for English literature, do you think? Would it change anything? Or?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, as I say, it would open up so many new interpretations of the works, you know. I think it would have a tremendous impact. Yeah, it would be a whole new field of research. It would open up.
Well, yeah.
I have another, this is more a comment than a question. I also study a bit about the secret societies and Freemasons and stuff, and I came across an article about the Rosicrucians. They said that Francis Bacon was also part of the Rosicrucians, and they're quite open about the fact that he may have been the actual William Shakespeare. Have you come across that?
Yes, if you read my book, actually, I believe that Bacon was the one who wrote the two Rosicrucian manifestos when he was a young man. After his stay in France, he went to Germany and visited, I believe, some of the cells which still remained. There were very few left, but he had a good friend, John Dee, who had contact with them. And it's a fictional story, but I have a whole chapter saying precisely that. Because the way that the first of the manifestos, the one called the Fama, is written. It's written clearly by a young man, who's traveling around Europe, and it just fits perfectly in with what Bacon was doing at the time. And it's a call, basically, for people to rise and to recognize their spirituality and think in terms of a new vision for humanity and all these flowery expressions and so on. Now, there was actually a third Rosicrucian document which was published later, the wedding of Christian Rosenkranz. Yeah, and I believe that's a different author who was trying to capitalize on the other two. And this story is mentioned in the book as well. And it's clear that the two first manifestos have a lot of spiritual codes in them, and have been interpreted as such by experts in that particular technique. So yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and I think the Rosicrucian movement it's never been very well documented. There are a lot of rumors about how it started and so forth. And what they were saying about it at the time was that you cannot be a member of this society. You cannot become a member, but you are a Rosicrucian. In other words, it's not something you can join, but it's something you can become, a kind of a spiritual person, a more spiritual person. But there was a lot of speculation about who these people were and so forth, and it was never really cleared up. Then it became also a political issue because in the Holy Roman Empire, which is based at that time in the court of Prague, they were very much supportive of this idea, and it was their political views were in conflict with King James in England, and it was considered to be politically incorrect to be a Rosicrucian, and seen from the point of view of King James, because it would seem to be showing that you were perhaps allied with his political opponents. So I think that's another reason why Bacon kept it hidden. He didn't want it to be public. But I think gradually what happened was that the ideas of the Rosicrucians evolved into the Freemasons as a kind of the Freemasons were more open, but they also had they had two sides. And in fact, the emblem of the Templars was the horse with two riders facing different directions, something it was, And so you had the outside, and you had the so-called speculative aspects of Freemasonry. The outside was the actual masons who built structures, and the inside was the spiritual aspect. And that's the way I think still is this day today. They have these two aspects.
Yes, I have a question. How it did affect and inspired your life, the search you have made, and the writing of the book?
Well, actually, it's very little directly to do with my life otherwise. I just thought it was a great story, and I spent about 2 or 3 years of my life, not all full-time, but part-time, exploring it and writing these books, simply because I thought it was fun. to go into the detail and find out what was actually happening. It's like an adventure. But I sympathize a lot with the person Francis Bacon, having studied him. I mean, he was a really fantastic individual. He did so many things, and he was also known to have abilities. For example, some of his contemporaries mentioned that he could speak in many different dialects, and he could write in many different ways, and his actual writing could change not only in the words he used, but in his handwriting. It's as if he could operate from either the left or the right brain in different situations. A very incredible person. And interestingly, also, all his contemporaries had tremendous respect for the man, and he was loved by all. And yet, if you look back, most people today have a complete different attitude. And that has to do with 200 years or so after his death, there was an English journalist, Macaulay, who wrote a very negative article, an interpretation of Bacon, without any evidence. He just made claims that he was a despicable person who was a traitor to his little brother, and all kinds of things that were completely false. And yet, because of his influence, his version is the one which most people have adopted since then. So you see a lot of people referring to him as a corrupt judge and that sort of thing. I think he was one of the greatest individuals that's yet made his mark on this planet. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think as a supplement to this, he also had a premonition of his father's death.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And about the Oak Island story, there was a mention in the Boston Standard of April this year that a treasure hunter had found coins with the sign Knights of the Templar.
Oh, really?
In the money pit.
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
All right.
Oh, fascinating.
I think that's fascinating because it's a long time ago since the last attempts were made, I think back in the 70s or and then to get down and
Yeah,
see
yeah.
if there's the real treasure below, and if the documents are the original manuscripts of Shakespeare is really there.
Yeah. My theory is that I think the Masons buried something down there, and then they forgot how to get down to it.
Yeah.
Somehow they lost the access key.
Mm.
It was probably designed in such a way that you have to go in somehow from an angle to get there, instead of going straight down.
Yeah.
That's my guess, at least.
Some of the attempts, I think they have used explosives,
Mm-hmm.
and that may have destroyed the access key.
Uh-huh. Yeah. But it's amazing that even with the most modern engineering techniques,
Yeah.
they can't figure it out.
Indeed.
Very exciting, boss. Yeah, very.
Thank you.
Other questions?
No more comments? So, shall we round off then?
You must have been a really spiritual man.
Bacon?
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. Some people claim he was a master at I think at the fourth initiative level. Very, very rare.
What is that? Can you
Yeah.
elaborate on that? What is that? I didn't catch
Well, there is a theory among some spiritual people that you go through different initiations, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. And the fourth level is very, very rare. You know, you're talking about Jesus at that sort of level. You know.
Has he any known teachers?
Hmm?
Has he any known teachers?
Teachers?
Yeah. Do you know anything about his teachings?
No, not spiritual teachers, no. I know in the real world, some of the people who had great influence upon him were, one was John Dee, who was kind of a mystic mathematician, and another was Giordano Bruno, the Italian philosopher. But at the spiritual level, I don't know. There are people who claim that he also has reincarnated at different periods, as among other things, Saint Germain, who's known among some spiritual circles to have appeared and disappeared in different periods. And others have claimed that he also was incarnated as Plato and Plotinus.
Okay.
There are a lot of similarities in many of their ideas.
Did you have any response from English people?
Pardon?
Did you have any response from English people to the book?
Well, it's just, interestingly enough, yes, but mostly negative, because in England, to claim that Will Shakespeare did not write the Shakespeare works is almost the same as denying the Holocaust. I mean, it's so deeply ingrained. There are so many academic careers based on, and tourist attractions based on that, the man from Stratford, that it would just, it would be like an earthquake that would shake them to the foundation. So when I was actually publishing this book, I tried to get a hold of an agent in the UK who would help do some promotion, and I asked around, and it was very difficult. And I finally got a hold of one woman. I said, "Why? What's the problem?" And she said, if I took on this book, I would lose a lot of my other clients. I participated once at the Globe Theatre in London after the book was published at a conference on the authorship at the Globe Theatre, and there were people from all over the world coming to discuss the question. It wasn't just Bacon; it was about all the different possible theories, And there were a couple of American professors there too, of literature, and they were very much in agreement that Shakespeare from Stratford could not have written these works. But they said that if in the United States they were to publish a paper putting a question on whether Will Shakespeare had written them or not, they would possibly be losing their tenure at the university. Even in America. And of course, even more so in the UK. It's just something you don't do. You don't raise this question. It's like, don't rock the boat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider a Danish translation?
Not really.
Not really.
But I think at some point I'm hoping that it could be revived. If some, I think it would make a tremendous film, for example.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I hope that at some point a producer. I have a friend in Denmark who's won a few Oscars for documentary films. I'm going to talk to him soon and about whether he has any good contacts in Hollywood.
Mm.
But I think it's just fantastic material for a film.
Mm.
And it would really shake up the whole
Yeah,
establishment.
Wow.
It'll happen eventually. I don't know whether I'll live to see it, but it will happen.
That's good.
Any more questions, comments? Okay, let's give him a big hand.
That was lots of fun.
Thank you very much, Ross, for one more exciting lecture. This is for you. And there's a lot of good books.
Thank you. Yes, if anyone is interested, I have some copies of the two books, the novel and the companion with the documentation. You can buy them both for 300 kroner if you're interested.